The first time he snapped his fingers at me, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because men like him always think power comes from volume, expensive shoes, and the illusion that everyone around them exists to serve them. He stood there in the cold morning fog outside my Silicon Valley office complex, holding 2 phones and wearing the kind of confidence only venture capital money can buy. Then he tossed his Bentley keys at me and told me to park his car before he fired me. What he did not know was that I owned the entire property, including the parking space he had illegally stolen from me. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and after my husband passed away, I inherited one of the largest privately owned tech campuses in Northern California. Most people never recognized me because I preferred it that way. I handled landscaping myself sometimes, inspected maintenance crews, and walked the property every morning before sunrise with coffee in my old steel thermos. I liked staying invisible because invisible people hear everything. They see how others behave when they think nobody important is watching. That morning, I noticed a matte black Bentley parked diagonally across 2 spaces near the main entrance of Building C. One of those spaces happened to be mine, clearly marked with a faded stencil that read, "Reserved E. Mercer." The car looked ridiculous sitting there like some oversized beetle dropped onto the pavement. I had barely finished staring at it when the lobby doors opened, and out walked the man responsible. His name was Brandon Cole, the new operations director for a startup called Nova Axis AI. 6 months earlier, the company had rented the top floors of my property after receiving a massive funding round. Before the money arrived, their executives were respectful professionals who understood contracts and boundaries. After the investors showed up, the entire company transformed into a circus of oversized egos and 24-hour hustle culture. Brandon walked straight toward me without even looking at my face. He saw my work boots, canvas jacket, and utility keys hanging from my belt loop, and immediately decided what I was worth. He tossed the Bentley keys toward me like I was a valet. "Park this somewhere close," he said. "And do not scratch the rims unless you want to lose your job." I did not catch the keys. I watched them slam into the pavement and skid through a puddle beside the flower beds. The look on his face was incredible. Pure disbelief. Like reality itself had betrayed him. "Are you serious right now?" he snapped. "Pick those up." I took a calm sip of coffee and looked at the Bentley. "It is parked in a restricted loading zone," I said quietly. "And you dropped your keys." His jaw tightened instantly. He stepped closer, smelling like cologne and energy drinks. "Do you know who I am?" "Unfortunately, yes." He pointed at himself proudly. "I run operations here. I can replace every worker on this property before lunch." I smiled at him slowly. "Then maybe you should start with someone who parks legally." He cursed under his breath, snatched the wet keys off the ground, and stormed back inside while threatening to report me to management. I watched the doors close behind him, and felt something settle deep in my chest. It was not anger exactly. It was focus. Brandon had no idea he had just started a war over a parking space. Back in my office, I pulled up Nova Axis' entire lease agreement. The company occupied nearly 60% of my campus, which meant every violation carried serious consequences. Deep in the contract sat Section 14, a brutal little clause my late husband insisted we include years ago. It gave the landlord authority to repossess personal property tied to repeated lease violations and unpaid damages. Most tenants never triggered it because most adults understood basic respect. Brandon clearly did not. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to Nova Axis. Once I looked beneath the surface, the entire company began rotting in front of me. They had employees riding electric scooters through the marble lobby, unauthorized construction crews tearing apart guest parking areas, and blocked emergency exits hidden behind gaming equipment and decorative furniture. They even installed private electric vehicle chargers without permits, damaging underground wiring connected to neighboring medical research labs. The worst part was Brandon himself. Every day he humiliated somebody new. He screamed at baristas over oat milk shortages, insulted maintenance staff in front of tenants, and treated junior employees like disposable garbage. One exhausted assistant quietly admitted HR already had multiple complaints against him, but the board ignored everything because Brandon kept attracting investors. That was the problem with modern tech culture. As long as money kept flowing, people confused arrogance for leadership. A few days later, I attended one of the building networking events. Brandon stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by young employees laughing at every sentence that came out of his mouth. I stayed near the back, holding sparkling water while listening carefully. At one point, another executive asked whether the landlord approved their expansion plans for the property. Brandon laughed loudly. "The landlord is some old shell company," he said. "We practically own the place anyway." Then he admitted he had never even read the lease agreement. That sentence alone almost made me smile. The final straw came during an investor tour that Friday afternoon. A convoy of black luxury SUVs rolled onto the property carrying potential international investors worth billions. Brandon greeted them like a king showing off his empire. And right there beside the entrance sat his Bentley again, parked illegally in my reserved spot. One of the investors asked whether the company had guaranteed parking access. Brandon slapped the Bentley proudly. "This whole lot is basically ours," he bragged. "The landlord answers to us." Then he noticed me trimming hedges nearby. "Hey," he shouted while snapping his fingers. "Clean these leaves up and try looking less homeless when important guests arrive." The investors laughed awkwardly while I stood there holding hedge clippers in silence. Something cold moved through me in that moment. Not humiliation. Precision. I pulled out my phone after they disappeared inside. Frank Towing, a rough, gravel-voiced man who had worked with me for years, answered on the second ring. "Need something moved, Mrs. Mercer?" "Yes," I said while staring through the lobby glass at Brandon giving his presentation. A Bentley, full impound. Frank arrived within minutes. The flatbed truck roared into the parking lot like a tank. Since the Bentley was locked and parked illegally, the winch dragged it screaming onto the truck while Brandon and his investors watched helplessly through the glass walls. I will never forget Brandon's face. He burst out of the building just as the truck pulled away. "Where the hell is my car going?" I folded my hands calmly. "Impound lot, pending lease violation penalties and property damages." "You cannot do that." "Actually, I can. You signed the paperwork." The next few days destroyed him completely. My attorney sent Nova Axis a formal notice of breach. I forwarded evidence of code violations and unauthorized construction directly to their parent investors in New York. Suddenly, the same executives who once celebrated Brandon's aggressive leadership began viewing him as a legal disaster waiting to explode. 3 days later, I attended an emergency board meeting inside the very building he thought he controlled. This time I wore a charcoal designer suit instead of my work jacket. When I entered the conference room, Brandon looked genuinely confused. "Why is she here?" One of the investors answered before I could. "Because she owns the property you have been damaging for months." The room went silent. I laid photographs, reports, and lease documents across the conference table one by one. Every illegal construction project, every fire code violation, every complaint. Every lie he told investors about owning property rights he never had. Brandon tried interrupting repeatedly, accusing me of personal revenge, but nobody listened anymore. The illusion was broken. Without arrogance protecting him, he just looked pathetic. Finally, the lead investor spoke. "Effective immediately, Brandon Cole is terminated pending formal investigation." His face lost all color. Security escorted him out, carrying a cardboard box filled with desk junk, while employees watched from behind the glass lobby walls. At the same moment, Frank Towing returned to remove several illegally parked company vehicles from the fire lane. Brandon stood on the sidewalk staring at me with hatred burning in his eyes. "You ruined my life," he whispered. I stepped closer calmly. "No, Brandon. You ruined it yourself the second you decided respect only belonged to rich people." Then I turned around and walked back toward my building, while tow trucks hauled away the rest of Nova Axis executive fleet behind me. The morning fog had finally burned away, and for the first time in weeks, the campus felt peaceful again. Later that afternoon, I stood in my parking spot holding a fresh oat milk latte from the cafe downstairs. The white reserved E. Mercer stencil was visible again beneath the sunlight. Funny thing about power. The loudest people almost never have it. The people who truly own the room usually do not need to announce themselves at all.